So this is the second part of our lesson here on income inequality and poverty. So this time what we'll do is go into detail about how someone is determined to be in poverty, what poverty is, and then the government programs and how economics works to attempt to bring people out of poverty. Okay, so let's begin by defining poverty. So poverty is defined as the state or condition of having little or no money, goods, or means of support. Now, that's kind of an ambiguous definition because it's the state or condition of. And so what we have to do is qualify that by placing a line as to say, okay, this is what it means to have little or no money. And so the poverty rate is the percentage of the population whose family income falls below an absolute level called the poverty line. So what the government does is the government establishes a minimum amount of money depending on the number of family members that would put you in a category of poverty. Now, when you do that though, it allows you to then provide benefits to those individuals who fall below that line. So when you're looking here, these are the poverty levels. So you'll notice the size of the household, and then you'll notice the percentages here, so federal poverty levels. So what you're looking at here is basically these are the amounts of income in terms to allow you to be placed on poverty and receive benefit levels. So it works different here. So when you're applying, it's number of households, you'll notice the size 100%, 138, these different numbers that become involved in. But what it's designed to do is it's designed to look at that and say, okay, if you aren't making this much money a year, then you are considered to be living in poverty, and so then you can apply for the different benefits. So the poverty line is an absolute level of income set by the federal government for each family size below which a family is deemed to be in poverty. Now we can look at this. This is over the last 30 years. So 1980 to 2010 is our data here. Looking at the poverty rates, you'll notice in 1980 the poverty rate was just over 13%, and it rose over 15% in 1983. Again in 1993, and again in 2010. So what we're really seeing is basically we see this poverty rate that it tends to reach these certain levels. Like you notice it goes 15.1%, it drops all the way down in 2000 to 11.3%, but then it rises again to 15.1%. So much like the unemployment rate, much like inflation and deflation, poverty fluctuates. And when we see that, of course, is the relationship to unemployment. What you'll notice is in years in which the unemployment rate is high, poverty rates, of course, are high. If there are more jobs available, then the poverty rate becomes lower. So anytime you see an issue within the economy in which the number of jobs that are in the market is declining, so unemployment is rising, poverty is going to be rising along with it. And this one here will help us to get that number even better. So you'll notice this is the number in poverty and the poverty rate from 1959 to 2011. So in our top one, it's going to show us the number of people that are actually living in poverty. Now what's interesting about this is that you notice in 1959, there was just a tad under 40 million people living in poverty. You look at the current in 2011, and you see that 46.2 million people are living in poverty. Well, that makes sense because over that time, the number of people living in this country has increased. So the number of people living in poverty is going to increase. You'll notice, of course, those blue areas shaded there are areas of recession. And you'll see that what's happening with the poverty rates there. And they go up, of course, and that's because that's what we see when the economy begins to slow down and the number of jobs available disappears and unemployment goes up, poverty rates are going to rise. And at the bottom there, you can see those percentages, how the poverty rate has declined. Then it kind of stayed out in between 10 and 15% for the most part. So are people better off than they were in 1959? The answer to that one is yes, because we see that fewer people are living in poverty. However, it's also no, because if you'll notice that we still have 15% of the population living in poverty, and we still have there are more people living in poverty now than there were back in 1959. So one of the things that tells us is, if you look at it, is that the income inequality that we're seeing goes right along with this. And this idea of using minimum wages to increase the standard of living, obviously it's not doing very well because those incomes aren't high enough. And if you were going to truly change these numbers, you would have to find a way to create more jobs, but at the same time, you'd have to find a way not just to create more jobs, but to create jobs that paid higher. So that would mean that people living in poverty would have to acquire more skills. And that's really the biggest issue. If you look at the poverty rate and you look at who's living in poverty, what the first thing you notice is education levels for people living in poverty are much lower. So in order for those people to get out of poverty and stay out of poverty, you would have to find a way to encourage them to get a better education, to find them more skills so that they could get higher paying jobs. Okay, now, it's not just that people are in a state of poverty, but it's also the length of time that they are in it. So, and this is important. So you'll notice here that 51.1% of people are in poverty for 2 to 4 months. So this would be the time that it's taking them to find a new job. So they lose their job, they spend 2 to 4 months in poverty, they're able to get a job and get out of poverty. What's concerning is down at the bottom. This is the issue we have, and this is the real concern. When you start looking down here and looking at these number of people who are in poverty for over a year, sometimes up to 3 years, sometimes even over 3 years, when people are living in a perpetual state of poverty, that is where it gets very significant, because these are people who are living on the welfare system. And the goal of welfare is that you try to get people in to have them temporary benefits and then move them off of those benefits and to allow them to gain and help them gain access to better jobs so they're not in poverty. When you look at that and you say, oh my gosh, look at the number of people who've been living in poverty. 5.7% of people have been living in poverty for more than 36 months. Those are people who are living on the system, and those are people who, quite simply, the welfare is failing these people because they aren't able to get out of poverty and get a job. Now, there could be any number of reasons. Maybe they don't want to. But that's the problem with our welfare system, is it's designed to be a temporary solution to help people get back on their feet, and it's not a permanent solution. Then that goes right back to that problem we talk about with the free rider issue. So it's really important that when looking at poverty rates and looking at welfare, that from a political standpoint, that you figure out ways to make sure that welfare is temporary and not a permanent solution. So more than half the people in a state of poverty are there for 2 to 4 months, which that's the way it's designed to work. It's designed to be a temporary solution. Okay, so what is the relationship between poverty and minimum wages? Well, the government first attempted to deal with poverty in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression. In other words, poverty was attempted to be solved by the government in the 30s during the Depression, and the first attempt was to use minimum wages. So minimum wages were designed as a way to get people out of poverty. The problem, of course, that we see is that minimum wages don't equal living wages. So a minimum wage today does not cure poverty. In fact, it doesn't really help, because minimum wages are below what it costs to actually live on. So in an effort to improve the general welfare of the population, the government improved the standard of living. This is what they were designed to do. So minimum wages were designed to improve the standard of living, i.e. get people out of poverty. Okay. Now, minimum wage was designed to deal with both issues, because what minimum wage would do is it would give people jobs, and that would allow them to improve their standard of living. But like we said, those minimum wages have to be high enough to be greater than or equal to the living wage, and right now they're not. So let's look at some problems with that approach. So big thing here is elasticity of some labor markets means that as minimum wages increase, unemployment increases, and this is a big issue. Minimum wage jobs are very, very elastic. The demand for minimum wage jobs is extremely elastic, and the reason is very simple. Because you have so many people, literally anyone has the skills to work in these types of jobs, that the market, the supply is massive, and so the demand is very elastic. And so when minimum wages increase, the unemployment rates increase along with it. So automatically, every time you raise minimum wage, you're increasing the number of people who can't find a job. And plus, minimum wages are not necessarily living wages. Okay, so the question would be, how does our government deal with the poverty levels in this country? They do it through income redistribution, and it occurs through 2 types of programs. Public assistance programs. These are things you'd be familiar with, what we call the welfare program. And then we have social insurance programs, which Medicare is the one name you would be familiar with. So let's look first at the public assistance programs. So these are different from social insurance programs because of a couple of reasons. Number one, payments are based on need. So with welfare programs, if you need to be in the system, then you have access to it. Well, how do they determine if you need to or not? We go back to that, the absolute poverty level. Those numbers determine who actually is in need. It doesn't matter what the age or whether they paid taxes into the program. So public assistance programs are public services. They do not have a market for public goods, remember? Because when we talked about this, we had the issue with free riders and the fact that you don't have to pay in to use. In fact, the majority of people on welfare aren't paying into the system necessarily, and so, but they are using it, and that's how it was designed to work. So those welfare programs are considered a public service because not everyone is paying in, but everyone who needs to can benefit. So then that becomes back into that public good and that issue of the free riders that we talked about in earlier lessons. So welfare is a broad term encompassing various government programs. There's 4 major programs. One is TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, Supplemental Security Income, Medicaid, and the food stamp program. So we'll look at each one of these programs, then look at the social stuff, and then we'll kind of get into some government philosophy in terms of how you deal with poverty in this country. So we begin with the temporary assistance for needy families. Most people, when they talk about welfare, this is the program they're really talking about. Notice, of course, it's supposed to be temporary, yet we saw that 5.7% of the population in 2011 had been living in poverty for more than 3 years. So it began in 1997, and it's a state-run program subsidized by the federal government. So TANF is managed by the states. It's subsidized and paid for by the federal government, but the states determine, of course, who's getting the money. So it provides temporary financial assistance while aiming to get people off of assistance through employment. So the goal of TANF is to say, you've lost your job. We're going to help you. We're going to financially help you for a small amount of time until you're able to find a job. So part of TANF is helping people, but it's also helping people find jobs. Now, each state has its own rules and regulations for access to benefits. So every state is going to be different in terms of how long someone can live on federal assistance, and also the types of programs that are being used to help people find jobs or maybe gain access to new skills. So when you look at the TANF expenditures, notice 32.4% other services. This is various different things, but 27.8% is just straight up cash. Here's money. You'll see systems administration 7.4%. To me, that number should probably be lower. There's no telling what they're paying people for this. Almost 15% is other work support and employment programs, and then 17.5% is child care. That is one of the single biggest factors involved here, is that when you look at families living in welfare, one of the problems they have is, what do you do with their children? A lot of them, they can't go to work because they have to take care of their kids. So childcare for them is crucial, because then that frees up that part of the day for them to go and find a job. So that's how it works out. Now, it's like we said, it's supposed to be a temporary assistance program, but like depending on the state you're in determines how long you can actually be in that program. Okay, our next one is a supplemental security income. So supplemental security income is a federally financed and administered program that makes payments to individuals in need. So this one is done by the government itself. So they're financing it through taxes. It's administering through them. They're making payments to individuals in need. And it's based on income, age, and disability. So you can think about this from a supplemental security income. It's basically if you don't make enough money, or if you can't work, or if you're too old, they're going to provide you with money that's going to help you survive. It's like Social Security, except for it's a federal program designed for these individuals, primarily because these are individuals who may not be able to gain access to too much money within Social Security. So it's administered by the Social Security Administration, but it doesn't come out of the same funding source, which is an important thing to remember, because if they were to come out of the same funding source, Social Security would dry up pretty fast. The food stamp program in the United States is a part of welfare programs known as in-kind transfers. When you talk about an in-kind transfer, basically what we're talking about is just moving money from one group to another. And essentially what food stamps are doing is distribution of goods and services rather than cash transfer. So what happens is tax money is brought in, and then that tax money is then turned around and it's used as food stamps to distribute for purchasing goods and services. So it limits what can and can't be bought. So when you look at this, you see here, this is federal dollars targeting low-income families. Notice the overwhelming here, 43% is Medicaid and other medical programs. So basically, for families living in poverty, they don't have access to health insurance, so they get government-provided health insurance. You kind of look at the different things. 10% is cash assistance, 16% is food programs, 10% is tax breaks. Low-income families hardly ever are looking at paying, if they're paying taxes in for, so they're getting it all back from their tax returns. The government's not keeping that money. 9% is housing, 7% student aid. So you can see how these are set up. Now, the fourth of the programs here under public assistance is Medicaid. So this is the health insurance. It's the largest source of federal aid, like we just looked at, and it comes from the Medicaid program. And it's a state and federal program that provides health care to low-income families. The big thing here is minimum wage jobs do not provide health care. So these are people who are, they may be working, but they don't have access to health care, and thus Medicaid takes that place and provides them with health care that otherwise they would not be able to gain access to. It's designed to cover the cost of medical care for households that receive the benefits under TANF and SSI. So you have to qualify as low income to be able to access these different healthcare programs. So when you look at it like this, so poverty rate would have been nearly twice as high in 2010 without the safety net. In other words, if government assistance did not exist, you can see this number, almost 29%. We're talking about almost a third of our country would live in poverty without some sort of government assistance. So is government assistance, is welfare a massive program within our country? Yes. Is poverty a massive problem within our country? Yeah. Particularly when we go back and you think about looking at those income levels that we talked about with the quintiles, and how the first quintile since 1975 has not seen but a very, very, very small increase in their average income levels, whereas the fourth quintile has grown, and the fifth quintile, the top level, has grown significantly and created such a massive gap between itself and the other levels. In other words, the rich in the country were getting much, much richer, while the poor in this country were seeing no change in levels. And so without government assistance, that number that's in poverty would actually almost double. Okay, so let's look at the social insurance programs. So they're government programs that pay benefits to retired and disabled workers, their families, and unemployed. So if you've retired, which now we're talking about 65 to 70 years old, these are individuals. Retirement is being pushed back later and later. People are working longer. People who can't work or can only work at certain things because they're disabled. And then, of course, people who can't find jobs, unemployment. So that's who social insurance is benefiting. Both the Social Security Act and unemployment compensation began during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. Unemployment compensation was designed to be temporary. Social Security, of course, was not. Social Security Act encompasses several welfare and social insurance programs. And then Social Security is funded through federally mandated payroll taxes called FICA. And so what happens, and the ideal way this is supposed to work is Social Security, you pay in to a large account, a large fund. Now the idea would be is that you paid into it, and when you retired, you would get your money back. That's not how it works. And what's really going to be difficult is that as this baby boomer generation, the people who were born in the 50s and immediately after World War II, as they get older, and they're beginning to, at this point, starting to retire, they are the largest segment of the American population. And so as they begin to retire, what essentially is going to happen is Social Security is going to be dried up. All of the money going into it is going to be paid out to those baby boomers, because that's such a large percentage of the American population. So seniors followed by low-income Americans account for most federal money. That would make sense. You see 55% is elderly care, and then 29% is low income. Only 5% is unemployment, 8% veterans and active duty. So that's something to think about, is that you see a situation in which we're talking millions and millions of people are going to be entering retirement in the next 5 and 10 years. Those people are going to be added there into that 55% of figure too. And so it's just going to get larger. So let's look specifically at Medicare. So it provides health insurance to the elderly and to the disabled. And along with Social Security, it accounts for the largest portion of social insurance funding. So if you look at social insurance programs, Social Security is 1, Medicare is 2. That's where the overwhelming majority of tax dollars are being spent, is in areas like this. This is due in part to the course of the ever-increasing aging American population. Now, the last portion of social insurance is the unemployment compensation. Like I said, this is meant to be temporary. It provides funds for individuals while they are unemployed. Unemployment compensation is federally funded, but it's managed by individual states. So the government gives each state X amount of dollars, and then the states do with that money how they see fit. How they dole it out is based on their own rules, and each state is different. We'll look at the scale of income redistribution. So by scale, of course, we're talking about the size of it. So in the absence of government redistribution, a household's income is called market income. Now, market income is a household's income earned from the factors of production with no government redistribution taking place. So basically, market income that's our incomes. This is what we are making, and there's no movement of money. Now, when you look at this, you can see the market distribution of income is this blue line at the back. This is called a Lorenz curve. You'll notice there the line of equality. What the Lorenz curve is designed to do is it's designed to show us equality, money distribution. In other words, if your lines were to be flattened and equal to the line of equality, then you would have true equality within the economy. So when you look at the market distribution of income, what you'll notice, of course, is that we see greater inequality, which we notice, of course, we see what we're looking at when we looked at the different average incomes. So the market economy at the blue line, that's the market distribution of income with no government redistribution taking place. Money income is market income plus money benefits paid by the government. So that's green. In other words, money income is designed to increase equality. The use of income redistribution and benefits programs creates greater income equality in the United States. Well, how do we know that? Look at the red line. Notice that the red line is closer to the line of equality than is the blue line. So on this Lorenz curve, what it's showing us is very simple. It's showing us that market distribution of income to the red line from blue to red representing distribution after tax and benefits have been redistributed. So in other words, this shows for a fact that income redistribution does create greater equality, but you'll notice, of course, it's not necessarily close to equality, it's just more equal. It's still not equal. There's a huge amount of gap there between that line of equality and the distribution after taxes. Okay, so when we talk about welfare and we talk about redistribution of income, there's been a lot of different plans over the last 120 years, and it has to do with political philosophies. Which political philosophy you hold, now this does not refer to parties, this is philosophy, determines to what extent you support income redistribution. So why the government distributes income is an important question, and it's answered based on political philosophy, what we call normative economics philosophy. So normative economics, it seeks to understand why we should make everyone help the poor and the best way to redistribute income. So normative looks at it and says, okay, why should we do this? How does redistribution of income, how does that benefit the population as a whole? How does that help everyone? How does that help the poor? And then, of course, the next question is, what is the best way to go about doing it? So there's three primary political philosophies that are related to the redistribution of income: utilitarianism, liberalism, and libertarianism. And so we'll look at each one in detail as to how they view redistribution of income. Okay, so we'll start with utilitarianism. It's based on the idea that government should choose policies that maximize the total utility of everyone in society. In other words, and this is one of the things we talked about with marginal utility and total utility, is what the utilitarian political philosophy suggests is that the policy should be designed to create the greatest or maximum amount of equality possible. So in this case, utility is defined as a level of happiness or satisfaction. So the question from a normative perspective is, how can we make people as happy as possible from their circumstances? You increase a person's, now from a circumstantive perspective, think about the movie Little Orphan Annie. Okay, if you were to apply a utility scale to a Little Orphan Annie, you would say that her utility increased when she went to live with Daddy Warbucks. And so that's the thing you look and you understand, is that you see that when you're looking at utility, how can you improve a person's satisfaction based on an improvement of their circumstances? Well, you got to think, of course, number one, how are you defining happiness or satisfaction? And then you have to set those levels up. So how do you improve that once you've established it? So utility is a measure of well-being, and the greater total utility of people in society, the better off society is. So their argument was that if you could improve the satisfaction or the happiness of the population, then that would increase society and make society better off because it would be happy people. So they promote policies which would maximize total utility in society. Utilitarianism promotes equality. So they would have the most amount of income redistribution. Their design would be to create everyone as equal as much as possible in order to make a happy society. Now, when you promote equality in society, what you're naturally decreasing is the efficiency of productivity due to the scarcity of resources. And here's the thing. Basically, if you're taking money from the rich and giving to the poor in order to create a greater equality within society, what you're doing is you're reducing the efficiency of the market, because remember, efficiency and equality are at opposite ends of our production possibilities curves, and you're reducing the lack of incentive. Why would I want to get rich if I'm going to have to give a bunch of my money away? That is what wealthy people say. From a wealthy perspective, there's no incentive to become very, very rich, because it's just going to be taken away from you. And that would reduce the investment. That would reduce our ability to produce, because people would not be willing to make investments. Our entrepreneurs would disappear because they don't want to make too much money. It's essentially, if you said that there's a cap limit of X amount of dollars, that's the point at which they would make, and they would not make any more. So the utilitarian idea of income redistribution is based on the theory of diminishing marginal utility. So an extra dollar of income to a lower income household provides them with more additional utility than does an extra dollar for someone who's rich. It would be like the idea that if you say, okay, if Steve Jobs were to be walking down the street, or if Bill Gates or any of these rich, if they are walking down the street and there's a dollar on the ground, does it cost them more to bend down and pick up that dollar than the dollar is worth? And there are people who have done studies to look at this and say, okay, yeah, if you're Bill Gates, it costs you more money in terms of time to bend down and pick up a dollar than that dollar is actually worth. In that case, you're not going to do it. Now, on the other hand, you take somebody with a very, very, very low income, that dollar becomes very valuable. So they will stop and pick it up. And that's exactly what this idea is basically arguing, is that eventually you have so much money that what are you going to do with it? You might as well give it to somebody who's actually going to use it and needs it and values it more. So there's a delicate balance, though, because if society is completely equal, then the incentives for acquiring wealth are eliminated. And that's one of the things we said here, is that from a utilitarian perspective, is the more equality you have in society, the less efficient it becomes and the less incentive to improve or invest there is. And so it would eliminate the wealth needed for redistribution. So you have to think about it. Utilitarianism with true equality, there wouldn't be any wealth to redistribute because nobody would want to make it. So our second political philosophy with income redistribution is liberalism. It's the idea government should choose policies deemed to be just. So they don't accept all policies for income redistribution, just the ones that they seem to be most fair. And by fair, we're talking about fair to every single person involved. Now, it would have to be evaluated by an impartial observer behind a veil of ignorance. And the reason they use that term is very simple. If you view society, you automatically are going to create bias, because you will automatically view your particular portion as more important than others. And this is from a sociology standpoint, when they talk about doing studies and things and case studies of individuals and moving in with a tribe or somebody you live with, they want you to do it as impartial. Do not have any bias. Do not carry any bias into your decision making. The reason they choose to say this concept of a veil of ignorance is because exactly that is all laws and policies were made to favor no one at all. So that person should assume that they could be at the top or they could be at the absolute bottom in the making of laws. That way they don't make one law that favors any one group. So because they were made impartial observers who had no knowledge of what would happen, the fear of being on the bottom would lead policymakers to make policies that would benefit the bottom the most. So their idea is that if these people thought for 1 second that they could be at the bottom, they would make laws to help those people the most. Their argument would be is if we took the people in this country who had made the absolute lowest incomes and made those people the decision makers within the government, they would make policies to help themselves. And in reality, that's exactly the case. people in power are always going to make decisions that help to, of course, maintain their power. So the concept of liberalism would be this idea that those people walk into a room to make laws on the assumption that they're at the bottom, that they could be at the bottom. And if they were at the bottom, or they had a fear of being on the bottom, then they would make laws that would help protect that bottom and would bring them up and create more equality. So liberalism sought to improve the economic situation of the worst. So notice with utilitarianism, they sought to just create equality for everyone across the board. Liberalists, on the other hand, wanted to focus specifically on the situation of the worst and improve the worst in society so that their condition would improve. So by transferring income from the rich to the poor, society raises the well-being of the lowest group of the population. And it would not destroy the incentives, because people could still get rich. Income equalities would still exist, but just to a smaller extent. So whereas utilitarianism says everything is equal, liberalists will say there's still going to be inequalities, but they just won't be as large. So utilitarianism sought to increase the total utility of everyone in society, whereas liberalism sought to seek just trying to make one group better and try to close that gap. And then we have this third group, libertarianism. So this is the political opposite of utilitarianism and liberalism. Both of these seek to freely redistribute the incomes of society as if it were a shared resource. So under a utilitarian and liberalist concept, income is a shared resource. It's a common resource that can be shared. Libertarianism doesn't think that way, though. It's a political philosophy in which the government should punish crimes and enforce voluntary agreements, but not redistribute income. In other words, they're going to punish people for doing wrong in society. They're going to enforce agreements made between the worker and the employer, but they're not going to redistribute income. But now, if somebody fails to do their part in society, they're going to be punished. So society does not earn an income, and thus has nothing to redistribute. So the libertarianist belief is that society is made up of people, and each of those people has their own income. Society itself doesn't have an income, so there's nothing to give other people. So there is zero income redistribution within the libertarian thought process. So people in society earn incomes. Now they can volunteer to give a portion of that income away. And if they do volunteer to give a portion away, then they must do it, because if they fail to do so, then they're going to be punished. So government should protect equality of opportunity, hence the punishment of crimes. Everyone should have equal opportunity to gain access to the same opportunities. So everyone has this equal opportunity to gain income, but income itself is not necessarily equal.